Since the inception of the country, the U.S. has a military force composed of the Army for locking down the land, the Navy for navigating the seas, and the Air Force to dominate the sky, and the National Guard to... What does this branch of military do besides invading California? I mean, the National Guard can provide help for states sometimes, but not all states, only the state they originate in. But they also can't enforce local laws in the state, but sometimes they can? What? Why? To answer this, first we need a definition and a history. The National Guard is a military reserve organization of the United States Armed Forces that is based in each of the 50 U.S. states, the District of Columbia, and 3 U.S. territories. It is among the regular reserve components that can become activated for federal and state missions. We will get back to the ways of activation for the National Guard later on in this video. The original National Guards were known as militias that were recognized under the Constitution, and each small colony or town would have a militia made up of random people from the colony. So back in the day, if there was ever a threat to your colony, instead of trained people, it was farmers like you and your neighbor Bob that were given a gun and told to fight with 30 other random people in your colony with varying occupations, usually against other people that were less than thrilled that you were there. This continued under British rule up to the Spanish-American War. During this time, the quote-unquote militia was synonymous with the United States Army. Many laws have been passed throughout the history of the United States that tweak the National Guard in one way or another. For this video, however, you only need to know 2 laws, the Post-Comitatus Act and the National Defense Act. These 2 laws shaped the National Guard to what it is today. Like most laws, however, they are mostly words, 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 and more words. The TODR is the Post-Comitatus Act, aka the PCA, prevents the federally recognized branches of military from performing any domestic law enforcement, and the National Defense Act provides federal funding to states for National Guard training, laying the legal groundwork for Title 10 and Title 32 activations, and transforms the state militias into the National Guard as a reserve component of the United States Armed Forces. Bam! See, I told you to remember the activation methods. Now that is called a Chekhov's gun. I bet you forgot, didn't you? Don't worry, it's fine. You can make it up to me by subscribing. I'll give you a moment. Okay, so now that we have the background, let's look into the really important stuff we hear in the news and arguments across Twitter. Oh wait, I'm sorry, X. How is the National Guard activated and deployed, and the justifications for the deployments? To make this easy to visualize and understand, I have a classic tool to help, the cherished Venn diagram, but not only with 2 circles, but 3. Okay, so let's fill this out together. There are 3 ways to activate the National Guard: State Active Duty, Title 32, and Title 10. And before you say it, yes, I know there are multiple other titles that can affect the National Guard, but those don't really matter since they influence the missions and not the activation itself. But just to make you guys happy, here's a quick image that shows it all. Okay, moving on. In State Active Duty in Title 32, the leadership is the Governor and the Adjutant General, aka the TAG, the Governor as the brain and the TAG as the right hand. In addition, both of these activations allow the National Guard to perform domestic law enforcement. The missions that justify state active duty vary according to the constitution of the state, while the Title 32 missions usually affect the nation/multiple states. However, in general, Title 32 and state defense missions are usually used for natural disasters and supplemental law enforcement for state conflicts like riots and terrorism. An example of state active duty would be the California wildfires that has affected 105,000 people and has costed the United States $3 billion each year to combat. And a perfect example of Title 32 would be the 2002 Winter Olympics to increase security. Now, why the US government and the state of Utah would increase security so much for the Olympics, I have no idea. Maybe something happened months before. Who knows? Now the big question is, what are the differences between them? Well, there are 2. For Title 32, it can only be activated by the President with permission from the Governor. While in State Active Duty, the Governor can activate State Active Duty whenever. The last difference is funding. In Title 32, funding comes from the federal government, while state active duty comes fully funded from the state. However, it should be noted that the state is allowed to use federal equipment and consumables, provided that the state pays back the federal government. The last activation type, Title 10, is when the National Guard is fully federalized. Okay, so remember this. If the National Guard is activated via Title 10, they are no longer your state's National Guard. They are soldiers that are part of the U.S. Army. Funding is the same as Title 32. The leaders are the President and 4-star General. This title is rarely ever used because the requirements to ever activate this title have to be extraordinary. But as always, in general, the rules are. It is to be noted the Post-Committus Act doesn't apply to these rules. Now the most satisfying part of the Venn diagram, the middle part, which is all National Guard activations allow them to cross state lines. Kind of. So as a quick rundown, for state active duty, they need interstate agreements that are talked about beforehand or at the moment, but permission from the governor is always needed. Same thing for Title 32, however, the Secretary of Defense has to approve it. And for Title 10, just do whatever you want. There, everything you need to know about the... Oh. Yeah, I'll mention it. Yeah, don't worry, I'll mention it. Okay, we need to talk about SDFs, aka State Defense Forces. SDFs are military units that are solely controlled by their respective state government. Before you say it, wait, AOD, isn't the National Guard already solely controlled by the state? No, they aren't, because of the National Defense Act. Remember, the National Defense Act gave the National Guard federal recognition, which in turn allows Title 10 and Title 32 activation. As a result of that, state representatives at the time were understandably a little bit antsy of the federal government having control over their militia. You know, whole states' rights being encroached on by the federal government thing. So Congress put in a paragraph allowing the creation of SDFs that are not federally recognized, allowing SDFs to bypass the Compact Clause of the Constitution, aka states are not allowed to have a standing army. So all states have SDFs. Well, no. As we all know, militaries are expensive, and SDFs are no exception to this rule. But now, they have to be fully funded by the state. Now, some states do have economies bigger than some countries, but some don't. So, not all states have SDFs. The states shown are the only ones with SDFs. The leadership and activation are exactly the same as state active duty. However, the training requirements to become an SDF is a lot laxer. In addition, SDFs play a more supportive role to the National Guard for missions. Now, it is done. Everything about the National Guard. However, I can sense there is an elephant in the room. Was our current president, Donald J. Trump, allowed to use the National Guard the way he did in his term? The answer to that question is for next video. Thank you for watching. If you like being the most informed person in the room, go watch more videos.